Hello, everyone. Just to let you know, this meeting is being recorded, so we can share it for later use, but I will start with my little introduction. So welcome everyone to the Law and Society Honor Society first speaker series. We are honored to welcome Jessica HIlburn Holmes. Jessica is a graduate of Brandeis University and Georgetown University Law Center with over 25 years of experience. As a former diplomat and international lawyer, Jessica was the legal advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in Germany at the inception of the United Nations Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. Jessica served in The Hague as an expert on mission in the office of the prosecutor, as deputy in the office of the legal counselor at the US Embassy in The Hague. Jessica's assignments included liaison to the Scottish Court in the Netherlands for the Pan Am 103 terrorism trial and serving as a member of the 1999 US Observer Delegation to the UNESCO Diplomatic Conference and the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. Currently, Jessica serves as the Philadelphia Bar Foundation Executive Director and a member of the Philadelphia Equal Justice Center. Today, we will discuss Jessica's role to the field of law and the experiences she's faced as a woman to celebrate the tail end of Women's History Month. We will begin with Jessica telling us about herself, and then in the end, we will leave time for questions or comments. And with that, I will open the floor to Jessica.
Thank you, Aaliyah. It's really great to be here. I'm very flattered that you all reached out to me and invited me to speak about my career. And to the extent that any of it is helpful to anyone else, I would be really delighted. I do want to caution you about two things. I already told some of the people on this call. I've recently had COVID-19. My voice tends to break up a little bit. I hope you can hear me okay. And you may hear PA announcements because the building I'm in is in the process of vaccinating a number of people in the building, and they keep making announcements. So I apologize for those two things before we start. But I do want to give you a little bit of background on myself, because when you hear my bio that way, it just, even to me, it sounds kind of impressive. And like, what did she do right to manage to accomplish all of that? And I have to say that a lot of it was good fortune. And I'll explain that in the course of this little chat. First of all, I had the good fortune of being born into a family that was incredibly stable and loving, and my parents were both well educated and curious and intent on making sure that all of us were educated. I have three sisters, so they're four girls. I was also fortunate in that I'm white in a society where that's a benefit, and I don't take that for granted. I am a cisgender female, so I have sisters who are not, and their lives have been more difficult than mine. So once again, I've been fortunate. My parents were a pretty unusual couple because my mother was from northern Wisconsin and my dad was a first generation Jewish immigrant, so New York Jew. And kind of at the time in the 50s, it was really unusual for intermarriages of that kind. And in fact, it was impossible for them to get either a rabbi or any kind of Christian minister to marry them. And they ended up having to go to the Ethical Society. And that's an interesting little factoid, because I think in some ways that is what made the foundation of their marriage and my family upbringing, which was a very humanistic one. So no religion per se, but we were really taught to be honorable, moral actors, responsible for our own actions, responsible towards others, and to take initiative to make sure that we were doing everything we can to make it a better world. A great deal of belief in the imagination and capacity of human beings to improve their lives and the lives of those around them. So that was kind of a very, it's a nice place to be born into, and it was a really wonderfully nurturing environment. In addition, so my dad was a lawyer. He worked for the government in a number of different capacities. I spent the first 12 years of life in Washington, D.C., where he worked for sort of executive branch agencies and the Congress, and then ultimately in the White House. And my mother, this woman from northern Wisconsin who probably had never seen a person of color until she went to college, decided to study African American history and become an expert in African American studies. And she did this at a time that wasn't a very popular, or, it certainly wasn't a ubiquitous area of study in this country. And I think she did it because she recognized that it was a piece of the US history story that wasn't being told very well. And so I was also fortunate in that as I was growing up, she was constantly enriching my education with the things that she knew and had been learning and had been writing about. So I was a very lucky person to get that kind of a start in life. And that also caused me to have the freedom to, for example, when I went to college, I wasn't thinking about what job I was going to get when I got out of college, which is a little embarrassing to admit, but honestly, I didn't think about it because I had the opportunity to go and study what I wanted and just get to know myself, if you will. And one of the things that had happened as I, got older in high school and so on, the fact that we were in a religious household became a bit of a sort of divider, right? I mean, I didn't go to church, or I didn't go to temple, or I didn't get together with the people that I knew in those settings. That's a really fundamental aspect of US culture that I was completely outside of. And even when I was young in elementary school, I had a teacher who brought me up in front of the class and lectured me about how, of course, you have to believe in God because, here we go with the announcement. Sorry about this. I can mute myself.
It's really low. It's really
okay.
low.
All right. Oh, it's really loud for me. Okay. So of course there had to be God, because how did the leaves, fall from the trees? How does, anything get created? I was always sort of being challenged about this. And by the time I was graduating from high school, I had really decided I wanted to figure this out. I wanted intellectually to solve this problem for myself. How was I able to be a moral person and a good person and a valuable contributing member of society without having a religious identity? And so I went to college to study philosophy, and that's what I wrote my undergraduate thesis on. And sort of coming to the end of my life at Brandeis. And I chose Brandeis because in the 60s, so Brandeis is a four-year college with graduate programs. So it is a university. It doesn't have a medical school or a law school, but it has graduate programs. And it was founded by the Jewish community at a time when colleges and universities in the United States had quota systems for Jews. And my father, in fact, had been a victim of the quota system when he was applying to law school. So I was curious about that. And also in the 1960s, Brandeis had been a hotbed of radical movements, right? Abby Hoffman was there. Angela Davis was there. It was really, my parents had had friends who had taught there. And I wanted that kind of intellectual environment. I really was, I wanted to be challenged and feel that sort of fervor, if you will. Of course, when I got to Brandeis, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, it was not that kind of a place because the student body wasn't like that anymore. So, you know, the crucible of the 1960s, which brought the civil rights movement and so many changes to our society, which were happening when I was a young kid and living there. And I had sort of grown up in that whole thing. I got to Brandeis, and literally on the first day, one of the things I heard over and over again from the other women I was at school with was, wait, you're not Jewish? No one's going to marry you. And I, you know, the first time it happened, I laughed. Second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, I was like, wait a second, did we come here to get married, first of all? And second of all, what difference does it make? So the reason they don't consider me Jewish, in case you don't know, is in Judaism, your mother has to be Jewish for you to be Jewish. And the historical reason for that is that because Jews were so frequently the target of raids, right, marauding raids, and the people who would raid the villages would rape the women, that the sort of internal rule developed within Judaism that it was the womb, it was the woman who determined the religion of the child. So anyway, I got to Brandeis thinking I was going to be in this radical, you know, challenging intellectual environment. And I get, you know, hit with this, but you're not Jewish and no one's going to marry you. And I was like, well, that doesn't matter because that's not what I'm here for. And it was a great environment. I had fantastic professors. And I was able to do the work that I wanted to do and, you know, sort of answer the question for myself. Can you be a moral person without religion? And how does that work? And what are the sources of that? And kind of reinforcing the humanism with which I was raised, but hadn't kind of understood it. And as I was getting ready to move on from college, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And I had always been interested in international relations. Again, sort of as an outgrowth of the idea of the human family, right? We're a global community. I was curious about other parts of the world. You know, I had grandparents who had come from Romania and Ukraine, on my mom's side from Scotland. When my father worked for the White House and the Congress, he had traveled extensively around the world. He was one of the authors of the international banking laws that actually are in place today. So he had traveled all over Southeast Asia and Africa and other parts of the world, getting countries to sign on to these agreements and set up these systems. And he would come home with stories and artifacts, and I just really wanted to see the world. So I asked my father what I should do, because I thought, you know, he's been there. What can he tell me? And he said in no less words than this, you're no good at math, so you can't go on with an economics sort of perspective, and that's really what international relations people generally have. So you can go to law school. So I took his advice. I spent a year working before I went to law school. I worked in a law firm as a paralegal, and I will, again, good fortune came my way. I didn't do especially well on my LSATs. I did very well in college. I really loved college. I excelled at it. But I didn't do very well on my LSATs. And I wasn't sure I was going to get into any good law schools. But my father had actually attended Georgetown for a graduate program. He'd gone to Columbia Law School for his JD, but he had taken graduate classes at Georgetown. And I was accepted to Georgetown, and I'm pretty sure it was because I was a legacy. So once again, I had good fortune. And I decided I would go to Georgetown because it was sort of the best school I'd been accepted to. And now that I was thinking about a career, I realized that having that could be a benefit, especially because having not done well in my LSATs, I was kind of worried that I wasn't going to do very well at law school. The downsides of going to Georgetown for me were I had been to a very small college. I mean, I had lots of seminars with 8 or 10 or 12 people in them, and only a couple of classes that had more than, 50 people in them, very few. Georgetown, on the other hand, my class was over 630, and my section was over 130 or 120 something. And it was not the sort of environment I was sort of fond of. I didn't really love it. And I actually had a very difficult time in law school. I found it very constraining. So whereas I had sort of picked my major in college and I could study with all these professors who had great ideas and thoughts, and in law school, you learn to think and write a very specific way. It is truly training. It's not really awakening. And I was disappointed by that. I found, like I said, I found it constraining. I did, once you get through the core classes, you can, branch out and take some seminars, and I certainly took advantage of that. And that was better. I enjoyed that a lot more. It was the way I liked to learn. One of the things I didn't do, and I would encourage anyone going to law school now to do, is I did not take any clinical classes. And I think that was a really big mistake on my part. And I think I didn't do it because most of the clinical programs were about local issues, and I knew I wanted to go see the world, and I was going to work for the Agency for International Development for the rest of my life, which I have never done. So even though that's what I thought I was going to do with my life, it isn't in fact what I did. I mean, I worked for them while I was in law school, but I never worked for them after that. So I would really recommend that if you choose to go to law school, you do consider taking a clinical program, both because it is an applied opportunity to recognize that what you're being taught in a fairly constrained and narrow way really has value. You don't always get to see that in law school, at least in my experience. And I guess the other thing I would say is I would, that I didn't do, I was not in a study group. I, didn't sort of find a way to connect with other students. And I think that was a really big mistake as well. I think had I had that, I might have been a little bit happier. I honestly thought about quitting law school up until the very last semester. That's how unhappy I was. Even though I learned a lot, and much of it has been incredibly valuable, it was still a very difficult 3 years of my life. I dropped hundreds of resumes. So I had summer positions, internships sort of like, but they were paid. But nothing, I had worked for the Agency for International Development, for example, that wasn't going to get me a job when I graduated. So I hadn't worked for any law firms. I hadn't sort of paved the way for a job offer. And I dropped hundreds of resumes. I had maybe a dozen interviews, on-campus interviews. I never went anywhere for interviews. And one of those interviews was with a representative from a law firm who, sat me down, and again, I had a B- sort of average in law school. So, certainly not stellar. I didn't write for the law review or any of that. So I was very glad that I had gotten any interviews, but this man said to me, you know, why should we hire you when you're going to get married and pregnant and leave? And I mean, I was 23 years old or something. I was not thinking, again, I wasn't thinking about getting married. And I just looked at him and I said, you shouldn't hire me. I wouldn't want to work for you. And I got up and walked out. So the other thing I'd say is, like, don't back down from who you are and what you want, ever. I did find a job. I ended up clerking for a judge, a brand new judge on the DC Superior Court, which was fascinating because he was just getting set up. DC Superior Court is the trial court, so dealt with misdemeanors and some family law issues, which are terrible and difficult to deal with. But it was fascinating, and it was a great learning experience. I had to write for his opinions and so on. It was wonderful. And I went from there to the State Department. At the time, the Department of State Legal Advisor's Office only took lawyers from like Ivy League law schools. And Georgetown wasn't among them. And I wasn't among the top 10% of that class anyway. So I was not someone they were going to look at. But there was a program in the State Department, one of the departments, that had responsibility for bringing claims before a bilateral tribunal in The Hague on behalf of American citizens who had been in Iran at the time of the revolution and who had suffered financial losses and whose losses were less than $250,000. And as part of a negotiated settlement with the Iranian government, the US government took on the obligation of representing those US citizens. And as a result of that program, which was really large, they hired on contract a number of lawyers who weren't on staff in the Department of State. And I was one of those contract attorneys. So again, very fortunate. I would never have gotten a job at the State Department, but for the fact that this contract position came available. And I did that work for 3 years. And towards the end of the third year, I said, you know, you've seen my work. You know what I'm capable of. I either want you to make me a member of the Department of State Legal Advisor's Office, or I will leave at the end of my contract term. Because I had sort of had enough of doing the same thing for 3 years. I had learned an awful lot, but I wanted to move to other departments in the State Department Legal Advisor's Office, or I wanted to go somewhere else. And unbeknownst to me, the State Department had just had an opening in another department in the Legal Advisor's Office, which was very difficult to fill because it dealt with a global telecommunications contract. And the parties, the State Department officers who were in charge of the contract, and all of the other agencies that they had to deal with, because in the embassies overseas, the State Department is not the only agency there. There's also the CIA, and there's also the Treasury Department, and various representatives from the military. And this contract involved all of those different negotiations with all of those different agencies. And no one in the State Department Legal Advisor's Office, who is normally on staff, wanted to touch it. It was a really messy, difficult project. I knew nothing about that. I just said, you got to hire me by the end of my term or I'm moving on. And I got a phone call the next day, April 1st. I'll never forget because I thought it was a joke. And the deputy legal advisor called me into her office and said, we would like to take you on to the State Department, regular, roles in this capacity. And not knowing what I was getting into, of course, I said yes. And I learned a lot. It was an incredibly, it was real trial by fire. I knew nothing absolutely nothing about government contracts. So one of the first things they did was they sent me back to school. They sent me to Charlottesville, Virginia, where the military JAG has classes on various subjects, and one of them was this, and they were incredibly good at teaching it. And I worked on that contract for 3 years. And once again, I said, you know, I've done this now. You can see what I can do. I want to do something else. And the position in the US Embassy in Germany had just opened up. And I'm not lying, this really happened. I was writing the memo to the head of the legal advisor's office when the memo came across my desk saying that the position in Germany had just opened. So I typed a line on a typewriter at the bottom of my letter to the memo to that person saying, I would also consider being sent to Germany. And 2 days later, I got a call saying, we'd like to send you to Germany. So again, my advice is speak up when you want something. You have to let people know what you want, or, you know, you might miss opportunities. And when the opportunities come, don't hesitate, seize them. So I said yes, and I went to Germany to be the legal advisor. In fact, the last legal advisor at the US Embassy in Germany, because the position of legal advisor in an embassy is a very rare one. Generally speaking, the US government doesn't like to put its lawyers overseas. It wants its legal advice coming from Washington. It doesn't want ambassadors who are basically like little emperors in their embassies. They don't want the ambassador to have their own lawyer giving them their advice. They want them going back to Washington for advice. But in Germany, since the end of the Second World War, there had been a US government lawyer in the embassy because it was such a complicated multilateral arrangement with the divided Germany and all of the forces from the Allies in Germany. There were constantly issues coming up. So there was a legal advisor to deal with that. And when I went, Germany had been united several years before, a handful of years before. And I think the State Department had it in its mind that it was going to get rid of the position. I don't think they necessarily thought I would be the last one, but it turned out that way. And at the time that they were coming up with the decision that they were going to end the position, and I went overseas with my husband, who was a graduate student at the time and who had worked out doing his graduate work in Europe in order to accommodate my going to Germany. So about 10 months into my position, my year with Ambassador Holbrooke, the State Department decided they were going to take the position and move it to another city in Europe for another purpose. And I was going to get sent home, basically. It had nothing to do with my performance or anything. It just was, you know, sort of how many FTEs do we have and where can we put them and what are the important issues of the day. And at the time, terrorism and international criminal issues were on the ascendancy in terms of their importance. And there were what they call third pillar issues that they were interested in having strengthening in Brussels. And so they were going to pull the position from Germany. And I told the State Department that they had to find me someplace to work in Europe, at least for an additional year, because I'd uprooted my family, brought my husband to Europe. He was working on his graduate work. I needed to stay in Europe for at least a year. And at the time, the UN War Crimes Tribunal was just being established in The Hague. And under President Clinton, there was a huge surge of executive branch employees who were seconded, is the term they use, who were lent, in effect, to the United Nations to help that project get up and running. And I, in my capacity as legal advisor in Germany, had been involved in setting up some interviews with refugees from Bosnia, and in making sure that the transcripts of those interviews got to the Hague and got to the deputy prosecutor in the Hague. So I was aware of the tribunal, and the State Department asked me if I wanted to apply to that tribunal, and I did. And at the time, the deputy prosecutor was an Australian, and his reaction to my application was, well, you're not a prosecutor. This is a prosecutor's office. We don't really have a role for you. And so I said to him, well, I mean, you're a brand new tribunal. When you go to another country and interview somebody, how are you going to take the transcript of the interview back with you and any other artifacts or evidence that you acquire? Because when you do that as a government, there are treaties that govern how you do that. But as an international ad hoc tribunal, you don't have those agreements with those governments. Who's going to negotiate those for you? And he said, oh, I guess we do kind of need somebody like you. So I got to go to The Hague, which was great because it turned out my husband's research was being done in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So we were together again, which was great. And when I got to The Hague, I was one of 25 Americans seconded by the US government in support of this tribunal. We more than doubled the staff there. It had just really started. There were about 6 people working there when we got there. And it was amazing to see how quickly it grew, and to be really a critical, or at least an intrinsic piece of pulling it together, because nothing existed. We had a statute that created the institution, but there were no rules of procedure. There were no forms or practice. Everything had to be created to implement the intent of the statute. And there were people from all over the world, from all different perspectives, right? There were common law lawyers like us and lots of civil law lawyers, lots of different languages, even differences of opinion within the common law, the way the United States thinks about conspiracy and the way the British think about conspiracy is a very big difference. And we were defining these crimes for the first time in some instances. So it was really exciting. It was an incredible opportunity, turned into much more than I expected in a lot of ways. But it was also in the context of a big struggle between the US government and the United Nations at the time. So a few years into this assignment, a bunch of people who had been seconded with me were sent home, because the US government had provided staff, and they provided our salaries and all of our benefits, and they took care of our housing. And they had provided a lot of in-kind support in computer equipment, not just for us, but for other people at the tribunal. And the United Nations had a principle of charging countries 14% as overhead, in effect. If you brought a seconded person in, you also had to pay in addition to the United Nations for the benefit of their having your person. And the US government said, no, we're not going to pay that. Why would we pay that? We paid all these salaries. You're not providing anything. You're providing a little bit of space for these people, but no, we're not going to pay that. So the Secretary General said, fine, we'll send you home. And a bunch of people got sent home. I was, again, incredibly lucky, because the Netherlands was becoming the president of the European Union at the time. So the presidency of the European Union shifts around. I think it's every 6 months. I actually don't remember, but I think it's every 6 months. Might be every year, but in any event, it rotates among the countries. And the Netherlands was just about to move into the position of being president of the European Union. And as a result, the embassy in The Hague was looking to expand its staff. And I was able to transfer out of the United Nations and into The Hague's US Embassy on contract, in effect, for a short period of time to sort of cover that opportunity. And after that, I went on a sabbatical because I got pregnant, and my husband and I decided we would stay in the Netherlands. He, by that time, had been hired by the company that he had been working with as a graduate student. And he was doing some really exciting and interesting work. And we decided we were going to stay in the Netherlands. And I thought I was going to get a job with the UN Tribunal directly on staff, hired by them. That ended up falling through because part of the fallout of the fight between the United Nations and the US government was that people who had been seconded, like I was, the UN decided they wouldn't be eligible to be hired by the United Nations for some period of time. And I hadn't been out of the UN long enough to qualify to be hired. So although I'd been selected and, it looked like I was going to get a job with the prosecutor, it turned out I wasn't. And I ended up being unemployed in a foreign country, pregnant, having just bought a house that my husband and I were tearing apart. It wasn't really the best plan, but in the end, what happened towards the end of my pregnancy, actually after I gave birth, the U.S. Embassy had two staff people, two lawyers from the State Department, and that's because, like I told you, basically you don't have lawyers in embassies except in places where there are very significant multilateral issues. And The Hague is one of those. And so there were two lawyers in The Hague. One of them had decided to leave his position early and go back to the United States and become a professor of law at Washington University. And so the State Department called me and asked me, because I was still in The Hague, if I was interested in moving into the deputy position. And that's how I ended up getting hired into the US Embassy in The Hague for 4 years. And I was, again, just so extraordinarily lucky. It didn't feel that way along the way. The time I spent pregnant in a house that was under construction was pretty devastating and difficult. But in the end, it really worked out very well. I spent 4 years in that position supporting the work of the tribunal and a lot of other issues. Among them, as I mentioned, I was the control officer for Senator Specter when he visited, as well as other people. I worked on a lot of really interesting issues surrounding the War Crimes Tribunal, as well as some of the cases before the World Court. And after I finished my 4 years there, I was in fact hired by the UN, and I spent about a year there in the prosecutor's office again. And when I decided it was time for me to leave that work behind, and that was a complicated decision based on how difficult that subject matter is to deal with for a long period of time, and I had been doing it for about 10 years. And also because of some of the politics within the United Nations at the time with which I didn't agree. I moved from there to the bilateral tribunal that I had originally been hired at the State Department to support. So it was a very interesting bookend of my career with the State Department. And I stayed with that Iran claims bilateral tribunal for a handful of years more until my husband and I decided we were going to come back to the United States. And when we were coming back, I didn't know what I was going to do. I knew that I didn't want to do what I had been doing. I knew that I was interested in pursuing the concept of the value of teaching people about human rights in order to build more resilient societies. Out of the experience that I had at the War Crimes Tribunal, I really came to be convinced that it was necessary for governments to be deliberate about teaching those sorts of values and skills to citizens, because in their absence, the breakdown of civilized society can occur really rapidly. And I didn't have any idea that we would, at that time, I didn't have any idea that we were going to see what we've seen happen in this country in the last 4 years. But I'm not surprised that it's been happening, because the fact of the matter is the US has really been failing to teach that set of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that I think is really critical to that sort of effective governance and peace and stability. But I ended up where I am because the position became available, and I was really intrigued by the work that the Bar Foundation was doing with respect to equal justice in Philadelphia. I had spent these years, 16 years overseas, working on justice issues, bringing justice solutions to people that weren't otherwise getting that sort of opportunity, and came back to find that there are terrible justice gaps in this country. I was sort of embarrassed that I didn't know the extent of those justice gaps. So not only is Philly the poorest big city in America, but the numbers of people who have legal issues on the civil side, right? So not criminal cases, but things like their housing, their education, their health, the numbers of those in court in Philadelphia, as around the country, who aren't represented by lawyers and who don't have access to help, more than 80%, which is just terrible. I mean, it's crazy to think that, the Supreme Court says equal justice under law, and we've got a system that's that broken. So I am extremely glad to be where I am. I feel like the work that the Bar Foundation is doing with its nonprofit partners, the legal aid providers, is incredibly important and relevant at the moment. And I've done a lot of talking. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there and take questions. I hope.
Jessica, I have a question, because I'm here, I'm the Director of Law and Society. Dean Kilman is the Dean. She's president too of College of, what is the CHS? And we always change the name. We're the liberal arts part of our university. Where are we as teachers, not us individually, but overall, failing in teaching our students so that we're in a situation now where Q is gaining momentum, that the insurrection has taken place, and as you very clearly said, that we are letting our rights fall apart. What can we do to stop that?
So, I mean, one of the things that I feel really strongly about is nobody should graduate from high school, let alone college, without knowing what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is and how it came to be and what it created, what it founded, what it started in terms of an international system. I mean, I reference the fact that because I was raised in a very humanist household, I really did grow up with the sense of being part of a global family. And if you feel that way, then what happens in South Africa or Malaysia or Iraq or, Brazil matters as much as what happens in your neighborhood, in your city, in your state, in your country. I think that is a really important fundamental piece. I also think that using the principles that it outlines, every topic that one is taught should reference it. So when you learn economics, you should learn about the pieces of the human rights system that deal with economic rights, right? When you talk about science, you should learn about the economic justice issues that are bound up in our human rights system. So, I think it's switching a little bit of how we think about these things. If we integrate them, I think we'll build better citizens. I also think that obviously the foundation, it should start in elementary school. It did for me. I remember, I tell this story because it's really true. I went to Graceland several years ago. And the thing that most impressed me when I was there, and there's a lot to be impressed by, was the report card from his 6th grade class for which he got a grade in citizenship. Like, we used to care about this as a society. It mattered if you were a good citizen, and we took our time to teach what that meant. So I think those things are really important and need to be revitalized.
I just have one more question, and I'll throw it over to the students, because you and I kind of grew up in the same time period. And I entered into law firms about the same time you did, and there was no women except the secretaries. And the way the secretaries were treated, let's just say that, thank God it's not that way anymore. Abusive is a word that it doesn't even describe it. So what have you seen as a woman when you entered into the legal field then as opposed to now?
Yeah, it's huge. The changes are huge. I mean, it's still less than it should be, but it's so different. I mean, from the question that I got when I was interviewed, which hopefully no one gets anymore, why should we hire you? You're going to get pregnant and leave. To sort of, there's now a phrase that's going around about dignity law. And I kind of laugh because I think, well, if we had just been teaching human rights all along, we'd all know this, but okay, we can call it whatever you want if it works. My experience with gender bias has been pretty limited. I have to say, I was pretty lucky not to experience it much. I know, for example, that there was one time when I didn't get a promotion that someone else got, and there was certainly gender bias at work there. But in a 25-year career, that's not a bad record. I certainly didn't feel that I was less. My voice was discounted in any way at the international institutions where I worked. A couple of the prosecutors at the UN War Crimes Tribunal while I was there were women. So, it helped that the boss was a woman. That always helps. When I came back to the United States and I began meeting up again with people that I had known, prior to going away, many of whom had become lawyers, I heard very different stories. I heard horror stories about the way women were being treated in law firms. In the time that I was away, having my international career, the women my age were having a much harder time here. I mean, when I got pregnant overseas, I was supported. I, went to the hospital. I was 5 weeks premature. I went to the hospital. I was in the hospital for 10 days. My child was in the hospital for 14 days. My entire bill was under $50, right? There was never any question that I would get hired again. I mean, I didn't know exactly how, but I wasn't going to be discriminated against because I was a woman with a child. Childcare was very available and affordable, and I happened to live in a city where I could bike my kid to the daycare and then bike to work, and that all happened in 20 minutes. So I really didn't have the kinds of challenges that my counterparts here in the US did. I've been stunned to hear the difficulties that they've had. I do see that that has changed significantly since I've been back. I mean, not because I'm here, but just noticing that there are women now running law firms. There were no women running law firms when I came back. And that changes things. So, yeah.
Go to Leah and Ben. Do you have any questions? Sierra has a question. Go ahead, Sierra.
Sierra has a question. They can go first.
Thank you. Sorry. I was just wondering if there's any presence of queer or LGBTQ professionals that you've come in contact with over the years?
Absolutely. Both in my international work and currently, for sure. For one thing, there are a few organizations that we fund that are very focused on LGBTQ rights, and they are led by LGBTQ personnel. So very much so in my current position. I would say less so in the work that I was doing in the international arena, but there were certainly members of the staff who were LGBTQ, and that was not a secret or in any way held against them. I'm trying to think. I don't think that any of the issues that we dealt with, so when we talked about gender crimes and things like that, that was a very cisgender sort of discussion. So I can't think of any way in which it was part of how we were thinking about crimes and rights and redress, but there were certainly members of the staff who were queer. And, that's not always been the case in the international arena, as it's not always been the case anywhere, but particularly in the State Department. There are lots of horror stories about people who were unable to be themselves because their queerness was determined to be something about which they could be blackmailed, right? But when I joined the State Department, one of my best friends and one of the people that I ended up working with in The Hague had founded the Gay Rights Alliance at the State Department. So there was a very different environment than had been sort of earlier in the 20th century. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I also want to say, Evan, you mentioned sort of how secretaries were treated, secretaries, paralegals. There used to be people who worked in the kitchens and who would come around with tea at law firms back in the day. One of the things that my father always did was insist that anyone who called him Mr. Holmes was going to be called Mrs. or Miss, whatever their last name was. And that was such a small thing, but it was actually a huge thing, because that told the women that whatever their position, they deserved the same respect that they were giving him. And I remember when I went to work for the law firm where he had been a partner, that the women who worked there came up to me and told me that mattered. Any other questions?
Aaliyah, do you have a question or should I ask mine first?
You can ask yours first.
Okay. Well, I personally am a very big believer in social justice issues, so I am very glad to see that you are on the same page with that. But in light of the current pandemic, I just wanted to know, what is your opinion on how things are being handled with that, coupled with a social justice perspective? Because I feel like in the jostle of everything, people are forgetting that the pandemic is happening to individual people and communities. It's become more of this like giant ambiguous enigma, and we're forgetting the actual people and their daily lives that are being affected. So I just wanted to know how you are seeing the handling of that, whether it be from Philadelphia with the vaccines that I know are being given out for free in Center City, to Pennsylvania as a whole, to the US, to the globe.
So that's a huge question.
I apologize for that. Answer
okay.
however you'd like.
Yeah, that's okay. I love that you're thinking that way. So I run a foundation, right? So I'm head of a philanthropy, and I see a lot of other philanthropic leaders over the course of my work. And one of the things that I've seen them do recently that I think has been laudable, is a good thing, is that they have started collaborating themselves. So one of the things that funders do frequently with nonprofits is say, we really want to see you work together more, right? We don't want this stovepipe that's, a waste of money and energy. So we want you to collaborate. But the funders themselves aren't necessarily doing such a great job at collaborating. But the pandemic has sort of spurred some of that collaboration. So I think that's a really good thing. So if you care about social justice issues, the fact that people who provide food and people who provide healthcare and people who provide housing help are coming together, and the funders who fund them are coming together to look at sort of wraparound solutions, that's a very positive thing. It's not getting to the question that you're raising about what about the individuals directly, but in a sense it is, because if an individual has all of those problems and they have to go seeking help for each of them separately, that is a drain on those individuals, on their families, right? And some of those problems may just not get addressed because you don't have the energy or the time, or you don't know where to go. So the fact of sort of having some of this coalition building happening is really positive, right? Because it gives that opportunity. It's one of the reasons why I love the concept of the Equal Justice Center, right? Because if you can have one place where anyone can come with any problem to get help, that helps get them on the way to having the help they need, rather than having them walk up to one agency after another in different locations to find out that they're not at the right place. So that's one of the things I think. I also think that, like lots of pundits and commentators have noted, what this pandemic has exposed is the inequities that existed before, right? It has really shone a light on how disparate and unequal and unfair a society in which we live. And that is both horrific and terrific, because it gives us the opportunity to start to look at that in the light of day, not just, oh, gee, that's too bad, but now we have to make change. And I think we really are standing, as compared with the 1960s, it seems to me, we are at an incredible inflection point in the United States. We have an opportunity to really make change. We must seize that opportunity. I hope we will. But it isn't enough. When I came to the Bar Foundation, we would sort of, bemoan the fact that 80% of Philadelphians in poverty are in court without lawyers or legal advice. Now we're saying, if that's the case, that can't be tolerated anymore. What are we going to do to change it? We always wanted to change it. We always were trying to figure out how to change it, but we're no longer accepting that tweaking the edges of the system are sufficient. We're looking at ways to transform the system, right? And that's really, I think, where the critical thinking and the imagination and the risk taking. I mean, you know, we're not going to find a solution every time, but we have to start trying. And in terms of kind of, so the healthcare, the who gets COVID, in what numbers, who suffers the most, again, you know, Black and brown communities, right? The least able to cope, the most underlying conditions. Is that where we're setting up our clinics? Are they getting the first doses? Are we doing a good enough job to make those things happen? I mean, there have been some incredibly imaginative and heroic people. The woman who founded, the doctor who founded the Black lawyers, the Black doctors, and started giving out the vaccines and doing the tests first, and now the vaccines, is fantastic. But we have to, you know, it has to be more than just, you know, individuals here and there.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I have a quick question. So I know earlier you mentioned like for when you're in law school to join like groups and study groups and that nature. Would you have any other advice for like people going into law school, or like when you were in class, were you the very few women in the class, and how would you encourage other women or other minorities to speak up and to have a voice while they are in law school?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there were about 50-50 women, probably. I don't know. Evan, do you think that seems right? I don't think it was a lack of women. And I never felt like my professors didn't think women should be in the classroom. It was employers who thought women shouldn't be in the profession. But I think the best thing you can do, so again, some people loved law school, right? I'm just one person, and my experience was a difficult one. So for me, if I were talking to my younger self, I would say, definitely make a study group. And because there is such an emphasis in law in reading comprehension and writing, and like I say, writing a very particular way, find people you trust to criticize your writing, because that is the hardest thing, I think, to learn. So it turns out that I didn't actually form a group, but I did have a very good friend who was from Puerto Rico. Super smart, like just so much smarter than I am. But she had written in Spanish her whole life. She was fluent in English. She could hold a conversation, but she had never written a paper in English. And she gets to law school, and suddenly she has no value, right? Her words are not sufficient. And we spent lots of time going, I mean, she didn't know things like how to say however, therefore, nevertheless. Right, she had fluency in speaking, but not in this sort of formal writing. So if that's ever a challenge of yours or anyone you know, tackle it right away. Find the people who will help you and learn it as quickly as you can, because once you have that facility, the rest is a whole lot easier. But that can be a huge stumbling block. So that's something I would definitely encourage. If there are, I mean, we had a legal writing and research 2-credit class, I think, in our first semester, which was, you know, pretty insignificant. I don't know if they're doing more than that now, but that's the kind of thing that you really need to pay attention to, because it's going to help you throughout your life, not just your law school career. And with every educational thing, take teachers you like. To the extent that you have the ability to make a choice, choose to take professors that work for you. Not every teaching style works. And there were lots of times when I would change a class and take it the next year in order to have the opportunity to learn from somebody that I knew I would learn better from. You know, you have to trust yourself in those ways.
Thank you.
Mike.
We have just one more question because we're really running out of time, but Mike Pena has a question. Mike, you want to ask a question? And then we'll let Jessica rest her voice for the rest of the day. She is recovering after all. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
My question was, like, do any books come to mind when you like want to educate yourself on like global affairs and global thinking?
That is such a good question. And I wish I had thought about this ahead of time. What I will promise to do is think about it and get back to you. I mean, there are books by, oh my God, Samantha Powers, who was the UN ambassador to the US ambassador to the United Nations, and very active in the Obama White House administration. She was a journalist before taking on those roles, and she wrote a lot about the former Yugoslavia, for example. She wrote about the genocide in Yugoslavia. I thought her book was phenomenal, but of course I'm not coming up with the title. There are books by former UN Secretary Generals, some of which I think would be really valuable. But also, again, I can't think of the titles. So I promise to give this some thought and send Aaliyah an email with some of the books that I would recommend. The other thing that I've done is when I travel, so for example, when I went to India for an extended trip, I went to the bookstores and I took out books there about the country I was in by the people who lived there. And that was really wonderful. That was such an interesting way to learn about the country, not, you know, through the lens of some US professor, researcher, but truly from the people themselves. So part of the way to learn about a global perspective is to read about the world from other perspectives. Not sure I can come up with those titles, but I'll think about that too.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'd like to thank our guest and the Honor Society for bringing us this very educational, very inspirational talk, somewhat on how to succeed and all the rest that you've told us today. So thank you so much. Just one self-serving question. Do you take internships from Law and Society students who may like to help out? Because if you could send me an email, I'd love to connect you up with some of these great students we have.
That's a terrific question. We have a pretty limited internship program, but I will certainly put you in touch with the woman in my office who runs it. We would love to have members of your class of this section or subject expertise. And as well, I'd encourage you all to look at our website, at the Philadelphia Bar Foundation website, because we list all of the nonprofits that we fund, and we link to each of their websites, so you can learn a lot about the nonprofit world here in Philadelphia. And I have to tell you, the leaders of the nonprofit legal entities in this city are absolutely phenomenal. They are among the most sophisticated, clever, dedicated people I have ever worked with. It's extraordinary. Not enough people really appreciate how important they are to the life of the city, and what extraordinary work they do. It'll be inspiring to see. what they do and who they are.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Be well.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.